Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for Saladin, Haqqislam. In this video, we'll be talking about the strengths, weaknesses, and limitations of Haqqislam as a faction before jumping into Infinity Army to go through actually a very long list of regiments that make the faction what it is. Now, before we begin, it's kind of worth noting that Haqqislam has had something of a turbulent path through N5. On release of the edition, a lot of what had made Haqqislam strong in previous versions of the game became kind of washed out in the edition change. Like all vanilla factions, it saw a reduced roster, either reduced availability or some models that were previously quite important to the faction becoming unique to their sectorals, exclusive to their sectorals, not available in vanilla anymore. But more generally, Haqqislam previously had kind of an identity of perhaps not best in class pieces, but quite efficient pieces. And just by comparison to other things that received balance updates, many of Haqqislam's previously efficient things became less efficient by comparison. And so for much of N5 until about October, Haqqislam was in a situation where it was kind of struggling to find a meaningful identity and meaningful strengths. There had been additions to the faction, but again, until October, they were somewhat milquetoast, they were just not particularly impressive. And so, for me at least, although I did play some games with the faction, it mostly sat on the shelf and wasn't a serious contender because I was struggling to find a reason why I might take it over other things. And then, as with so many factions in October 2025, the major balance update was released, and that answer was given. Haqqislam was a major beneficiary of that balance update, not necessarily in terms of massive or overpowered additions to the faction, but certainly quite a lot of previously unimpressive units became much more viable, which effectively expanded the army's roster without adding anything to it at all, and one major change to one major character made an extreme difference in terms of reinforcing a previous strength, Haqqislam's use of irregular troopers, to the point where now Haqqislam's identity is firmly re-established. And so what is that identity for Haqqislam as of late 2025? Well, to begin with, let's talk about what we might call the on-paper strengths and limitations, the stuff that is fairly obvious when you just look at the elevator pitch for the faction. To begin with, you've got +1 willpower basically everywhere. Haqqislam is the faction that has on average the highest willpower values, where you have a faction like Pan-Oceania, for example, that tends to have +1 ballistic skill baked into most of its troops. Haqqislam tends to have +1 willpower. And while +1 ballistic skill is probably better, because ballistic skill is the rule that you will use the most, it's the attribute that will be rolled the most over the course of a game, willpower is a relatively close second. You use willpower for a lot of roles. You use it for discover and reset and for activating mission objectives, and if you are the kind of specialist like a doctor or a hacker or an engineer, you use it for all of those skills as well. And so Haqqislam has this kind of baseline, slightly higher success chance for all of those little ancillary things, some of which can really matter. Just barely passing a discover roll makes a huge difference compared to just barely failing it, since a model can't repeat a discover roll that it makes in the same turn. It can't repeat a discover roll that it fails. And so even though Haqqislam might have to, say, try twice to get a ballistic skill attack to stick, it'll often be in a situation where it only has to try once to pass a willpower roll, and that's really significant. In addition, Haqqislam is a vanilla faction, which means that it is generally very well rounded. There is basically nothing that is really missing from vanilla Haqqislam. And although we should kind of acknowledge that it is a little bit of a limitation that there aren't necessarily any really high watermark pieces in Haqqislam in many categories, you will be able to find something that is basically just fine at minimum in just about every category. You've got just fine regular skirmishers, just fine heavy infantry, just fine hackers and network projection. Not as good in each of those categories as some other individual factions might be able to do, but you can kind of do all of them, and that allows for a really broad play experience and a lot of list flexibility. Now, as we go through the roster of troopers, as we spend a lot of time in Infinity Army in this episode talking about different things Haqqislam has access to, you will absolutely hear me talk about a lot of regiments as, yeah, this is totally okay, this is usable, it's not fantastic, but it's not bad either. But when you have enough of those pieces, that is something of a faction's strength by itself. I really want to emphasize here at this point now that even moderate praise of some of those pieces isn't damning them with faint praise, because there is an underlying strength that underwrites all of those perfectly serviceable middle-of-the-line troops, and that is Haqqislam's final and most definitional faction strength, its access to irregular troopers. Now, this has always been a strength of Haqqislam. From as far back as N3, when I began playing the game, Haqqislam had access to interesting and compelling and unique and powerful irregular troops. And it's been my many games over time with Haqqislam that has led me to kind of coin the idea of an irregular budget in a list. Now, long-time listeners will be familiar with that, but if you're new to this channel and wondering what that means, an irregular trooper obviously does not add its order to the order pool, it reserves it for itself. Usually, irregular troops are relatively aggressively costed. Being irregular offers a small discount to a trooper, and when you have enough irregular troopers, those small discounts add up, particularly if many of them are also no-cover impetuous, which further gives you discounts. So does Religious Troop, which is also going to be present on many of these Haqqislam irregulars. And so we've got this big pool of appealing irregulars, but because irregulars reserve their orders for themselves, after your third or fourth or very occasionally fifth irregular trooper in a list, if you add more, what you will find is you simply can't execute a cohesive battle plan anymore, because you have all of these troops that are keeping their orders for themselves, and so doing things like launching deep attacks on your opponent, or accomplishing mission objectives, or even just pushing through some bad rolls becomes impossible because you don't have enough regular orders to spend, and you burn yourself out of command tokens converting irregular orders into regular orders. And so historically, even though Haqqislam has had the best and broadest range of irregulars in the game, there have been some limits on how aggressively you can exploit that advantage, simply because there's sort of a soft upper limit on how many irregulars you can have. And that remained the case in N5 until October, because in October, Saladin was updated to be given Inspiring Leadership, and Inspiring Leadership turns all troopers in your army into regular troopers, regardless of their normal training characteristic, which means an army led by Saladin has 15 regular orders in it, no matter how many troopers you have that are irregular. As long as you've got 15 troopers, you'll have 15 regulars. And we will talk about Saladin in great detail as the very first model when we get to the Infinity Army section. But suffice to say now that that change to Saladin hasn't broken the faction, it hasn't made it into an overpowered beast, but it has taken that strength, that access to many and varied and different and interesting and powerful irregular troopers, and locked it in as Haqqislam's primary strength and source of faction identity. And because many of those irregulars are efficiently costed, they've got discounts, they have all of those rules we mentioned that can be used to make a model cheaper. Even though Saladin himself is very expensive as far as lieutenants go, overall you have access to a package there that underwrites and lets you take more of those perfectly serviceable, more powerful, but expensive regular troopers, your heavy infantry, your super soldiers, your hackers, your regular specialists, your regular skirmishers, etc., that you take all of those in greater numbers because you've got this pool of irregular troopers as the core of your list that does things like skirmishing and defense and rapid attacks and provides your smoke and etc., which in my experience tends to be very good at producing lists with 14 or 15 troopers that are dedicated towards having an active battlefield role, and very, very few troopers that are even remotely close to being considered cheerleaders. This puts Haqqislam in a situation where they're quite difficult to put out of the game, because they probably got a viable active turn troop all the way down until you put them in retreat. And while Saladin himself does represent a vulnerability, something that you have to keep safe because you are really in trouble if you lose him, overall, now we are in a position where the lists are interesting and compelling and varied and have a ton going on, and all of that collectively makes them one of my favorite factions in N5 as of October 2025. And so for this reason, and mostly because time is going to be a pressure in this video, we're going to jump straight into Infinity Army now and pick up that conversation further and talk about Saladin and then everything else in the army that makes Haqqislam what it is. Now, since this is a vanilla faction, the links are quite varied but kind of less impactful, and so how we're going to structure this is, unsurprisingly, starting by talking about Saladin. We're then going to talk about all of the irregulars that you might take, since that flows on naturally from him, and from there we'll just go light infantry, medium infantry, heavy infantry, skirmishers, warbands, etc., in the order that they usually presented in Infinity Army. We're going to touch on a lot of troopers here, because there are a lot of troopers that are at least viable in Haqqislam. That does mean we will skip a few things, and we also might skim past a few things just in the interests of time. I'm sure that if there are Haqqislam players watching this video, you will have your own opinions, and in that case, please jump into the comments and tell me something that I missed or skimmed past, because there is a lot of meat on the bones of this faction. And that starts, of course, with Saladin. Now, what do we have here as a profile? Firstly, this is a Willpower 16 Lieutenant. Armor 3, BTS 3, with no wound incapacitation and shock immunity makes him modestly durable. He also has a repeater and albedo -6, and he's armed with a light shotgun, nanopulsar, and emitter. All of that collectively gives you, as a combat trooper, a model that can feasibly defend itself, but doesn't really want to if it can avoid it. He has a fairly good chance of stalling out an attack on him with guided missiles, but one of the things that he's going to worry about most is just any old chud with an electromagnetic grenade launcher that can just fire shots at him until one of those connects and isolates him, because if he is isolated, you are entering into a world of hurt. And the reason for that is that he will almost always be your lieutenant, and he is, pound for pound, possibly the most lieutenant-y lieutenant in the game. Now, I'm going to have a hard time saying he is the best lieutenant in the game, because that is too broad of a category. You can't put Saladin next to a Marut and say, oh, well, Saladin is better, because they're such different pieces. Lieutenants are a very broad category. Now, yes, Saladin would probably piss all over this clanker in a gunfight, thanks to his particular set of skills and equipment, but clocking in at 40 points and built purely for the purposes of leadership, he is very expensive, but very, very specialized. And that's because he has basically every rule that a lieutenant can have. He has Strategos level 2, which allows you to convert his lieutenant order into a regular order, and gives you an extra reserve, and lets you each round move one trooper between combat groups for free. Now, to note, you will often not use his Strategos order as a regular order. You'll often keep it as a lieutenant order, because he also has Inspiring Leadership. That's the skill we mentioned before, where every irregular trooper in your army becomes regular, and it gives you access to his lieutenant order to be used as a free coordinated order each round, with the only restriction on that being that Saladin himself must be the spearhead of that order. Finally, he has +1 command token, meaning that the only rule that he has, doesn't have rather, that a lieutenant might have, is +1 order, and otherwise he's got every possible skill that you might expect on a lieutenant. He's even got counterintelligence for that turn 1 push. And all of this collectively means that Saladin is going to be your lieutenant in something like maybe 95% of your lists. Now, he's not necessarily an auto-include, because 39 points is very expensive, and if you cut him for a cheaper lieutenant, you do start opening yourself up to be able to take more expensive things, more specialized things, etc. There are certain lists that might choose to forego him. You might also choose to forego him if, for example, your local community begins really heavily investing in EM grenades because the bugger keeps putting them down. But in general, he interacts so well with so much of the rest of the faction that he is what we would call your default lieutenant choice, and for very good reason. Now, that alone, all of that is excellent. Cool. We take Saladin. That means we can have a bunch of regulars. Those regulars are a little bit cheaper. That's our list sort of like set up in terms of the trajectory of the list, but from that starting point, it can go in many different directions. But there is another thing about Saladin that is not necessarily obvious at first glance of the profile that I really wanted to talk about, because he has another secret role, and that is he turns your army into the best army at using coordinated orders in the entire game. Or perhaps put it another way, if you play him, you must learn how to use coordinated orders and build your list to make use of coordinated orders, or you will not be getting the most out of him. And why that is kind of becomes apparent when we think about this whole package and how it works in total. All of our regular orders are regular, so we aren't spending command tokens turning those irregular orders regular. We have a Strategos 2 lieutenant, so we are unlikely to need to spend a command token for an extra reserve, although you can, and we are unlikely to need to spend a command token to move models between combat groups, because he'll do that at least once per round for free. On top of that, he gives you one extra command token, and Haqqislam is a faction that barely, if at all, needs Speedball. And that means in most games, you are sitting on at least 3, but often 4, sometimes even 5 command tokens that you have literally no other use for other than performing coordinated orders. On top of that, because he's an Inspiring Leadership Lieutenant, he will give you potentially 3 coordinated orders himself for free over the course of the game as you spend his LT order every single round as a coordinated order. And what that means is that building a list with Saladin, you want to really focus on building a combat group that he is a part of that can make good and interesting and effective coordinated orders, because you're going to be doing 6 or 7 or 8 of these every single game if you are paying attention. And that has a drastic effect on the value and utility of certain pieces and how they play. So to give you some examples of how a turn might play out, right? I've been playing a bunch of games with Haqqislam in the run up to this episode. How a turn might play out for me is, at the beginning of the turn, I'll take some impetuous activations with Ghazi Matawiya and Bikers. Now, quite a lot of the time, those impetuous activations will push those pieces directly forward. Maybe they'll throw some smoke grenades as part of that to cover each other's advance, but invariably, some of those pieces will end up in a position where I wouldn't want them to end the round there, right? I might not want to attack with a biker in this particular turn. Maybe I do. Either way, I don't want it just sitting out in the open. Okay, cool. From here, I want to get models into good positions and set up my lines of advance. And so in most Saladin combat groups, I will have 3 or 4 pieces armed with good quality targetless weapons, which can be pitches in some cases, or one case, but more often smoke grenades and smoke grenade launchers, which I will then begin coordinating. I will use coordinated move and ballistic skill attack, and have my selection of a Matawiya and 2 bikers and maybe a Zabak aeromobile unit as well perform movements. Remember, the Zabak can't use super jump, but it can still move 8 inches while doing that. To move and use smoke grenades and smoke grenade launchers. To lay down an absolute wall of smoke, even at very long distances. And if I don't plan on attacking with any of those units in a given turn, I'll also use those coordinated orders to move any of the things that impetuous into forward staged but safe positions on the board. Okay, cool. Well, from there, we're going to think about accomplishing our scenario objectives and potentially launching attacks on my opponent. No problem. That's going to involve some movement. We'll continue to coordinate orders as part of that activity because there are likely to be a bunch of pieces in my primary combat group that I'm interested in getting forward into stage positions, more up into the midfield where they can do some work later. Let's spend some command tokens and tag them into coordinated orders as well. And all of this turns into turns where you have 10, maybe 11 orders to spend, but you're able to accomplish 2 or 3 different really significant lines of activity where another list, even a list with, say, lots of tactical awareness orders, might be constrained to just 1. And to give a really practical example, in my most recent game with Vanilla Haqqislam against a Next Wave player, I was able, in a single turn, to use my primary combat group in corporate appropriation to advance one of my bikers forward, grab the objective, get it all the way back towards my deployment zone, get another biker forward, lay a bunch of smoke while I'm doing this to set up an attack both with those bikers and with a Hassassin for Day in the secondary combat group, push my second biker far enough forward to get multiple kills, pull back any exposed assets into a safe position after laying all of that smoke, stage Matawiya in a position where jammers were safely covering the secondary objective in corporate appropriation, and then still have enough orders with all of those pieces to launch an attack that killed a Stinger, Pandora, a Steelheart, and an Ironside APHMG. And if you are familiar with Next Wave, you will understand that is a very, very bad turn for them. All of that in the same turn off the back of this tremendous order efficiency Saladin offers. Basically, by taking him as your lieutenant, what you kind of get is, if you think about fire teams, we've always acknowledged that, yes, fire teams mathematically give you plus special die and all of these other bonuses, but kind of the fundamental benefit that a fire team offers is just that multiple models activate with the same order, which gives you a kind of order efficiency. With Saladin leading your army, you have across an entire combat group that exact same order efficiency with none of the restrictions and none of the downsides that trying to move things as part of a link has. He is very interesting and very special, and especially if you pay attention and learn how to maximize the use of coordinated orders, he will pay off extremely effectively. You just need to keep him safe. And to talk briefly about keeping him safe, because it is part and parcel. Firstly, there is going to be a temptation to take Chain of Command with Saladin. Probably don't, because consider that part of why you're taking him is to use Inspiring Leadership to turn 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 irregular orders regular. Chain of Command is not going to fix the problems that you find yourself in if you lose him, because all of those irregular models will still be irregular. Instead, you want to keep him safe in other ways. And the two best ways to do that, firstly, are just to prioritize his safety as part of deployment and play. It is going to be very common that I will have him as one of my reserve drops because I just don't want him in a position where he's any risk, and I'm perfectly willing to use his extra reserve drop from Strategos to benefit himself to maximize his safety. The other thing you can do is there are access to Hollow Mask and Hollow Projector and both models in this faction. And while I personally am usually willing to play without those, if you are uncertain, just consider taking something like a Bashi Bazouk or a Havsa just to present multiple Saladins for your opponent and obscure him that way. It's by no means a perfect defense. A canny opponent will often be able to suss things out. In fact, when EM grenades start raining down, for example, what you'll find is that the need to declare AROs by itself actually begins to sort of show your hand and show what things are going to be real and what aren't. And for that reason, actually what you kind of have to do regardless is no matter what is being hit by the EM grenade, you kind of just have to hold on to your butt and not declare an ARO. Because if Saladin declares an ARO, it reveals him as real. If the Bashi declares an ARO, it reveals it as real and removes all of the echoes. And so the insulation that you get, particularly against, say, a Kestrel army with 2 or 3 Jackals, isn't as significant as you might think. And for that reason, distance and the reserve deployment often is just your better defense in these particular cases. Either way, kind of regardless, no matter how you choose to defend yourself with Saladin, just be aware that as long as he is your lieutenant, you're in a great position, but you do need to take those steps and ensure his survival and really protect him with whatever assets you have available, because his loss is likely going to spell very close to certain defeat for your army, simply because you're going to have too many irregulars to play through what amounts to multiple turns of loss of lieutenant because of all those irregulars in your list. Okay, that's like more time talking about Saladin than we talked about the faction to begin with, I think for good reason, but let's jump now into all of the irregulars that we might take to take advantage of Saladin as our lieutenant. And we're going to begin with the classics, the Ghazi Matawiya. These are dogged and impetuous troops with access to a variety of weapons, but the important things here is that they are your cheapest sources of smoke if you want to take the 5-point profile, or you have a 6-point profile with a willpower 15 jammer. And especially at the price point, there is not a lot in the game that represents better value than a 6-point regular trooper with dogged and a chain rifle and a willpower 15 jammer. That's just a tremendously good defensive element that even has some active turn utility because a jammer can be used as a zone of control ballistic skill attack to intuitive attack things like camouflage markers, which can be used as a sort of pseudo sensor to reveal them. And while by default I will usually find myself taking either the 6-point chain rifle jammer or the 5-point chain rifle smoke grenades, you can, for relatively few points, upgrade to an 8-point boarding shotgun jammer to have both a jammer and smoke grenades on the same profile. And under some circumstances, you might also choose to take either of the Emirat profiles. Kind of either way, you can take up to 4 Ghazi Matawiya, and while there is a lot of competition for interesting irregular troopers in this faction, even in Saladin's list there will be constraints on how many you can take. I am finding that Ghazi Matawiya are usually being taken in the 2 to 3 in pretty much all of my lists because of how useful and insulating that jammer defense is. The other irregular profile that you might take en masse are Delami Infantry. And there is really only one profile that we are particularly interested in here. That is the Camouflaged Infiltration Light Shotgun Panzerfaust for 8 points. It also comes with a boarding pistol, which means that for a very, very cheap price point, we have A regular order with a light shotgun and a boarding pistol for a template weapon and a Panzerfaust for potentially catastrophic arrows for our opponent, that we can just gum up the midfield with a ton of these. And our opponent has to respect them because you can't just prompt a template or Panzerfaust arrow for free, but whom take quite a lot of time to dig out because they have that layer of camouflage, which means it always takes at least one extra skill to dig them out because you have to declare discover before you can do anything else, which makes them highly valuable as a reactive slash ablative ARO piece for many of the same reasons, but in kind of a different equipment system than Matawiya have. Just personally, I find myself leaning a little bit more towards Matawiya. After all, they are slightly cheaper, but both are very good. You can take both if you want, and different list constructions will want either in larger or smaller numbers. Just be aware that alongside Matawiya, Dalami are your other valuable, cheap, defensive irregular troop, which might never have an order spent on them, but which can be very valuable as ARO pieces, just buying you time for that first turn. Now, on the offensive side of things, and considerably more expensive but very worthwhile, we have two bikers, Zuleika Nazarova and Zamira Nazarova. Now, you can also take regular Coom Riders. They are generally 7 points or so apiece. You can take 6.1s as well. I tend to avoid those and instead run each of the two biker twins, mostly because there are enough significant and interesting upgrades on them to make that worthwhile. Zuleika, for example, is much better in close combat and has much better ballistic skill attacks and has much better templates. Zamira, by comparison, is better at making regular ballistic skill attacks thanks to being ballistic skill 12 and having a fairly solid +1 burst AP heavy pistol. But in both cases, kind of the really big difference is that regular Coom Riders are dogged but are not shock immune. Zuleika and Zamira are shock immune. These girls make excellent use of coordinated orders. In the example I gave before, we talked about how they zoomed forward with impetuous activations, then they used coordinated orders to make targetless attacks with smoke grenades and smoke grenade launchers to push the line for other things to be able to move. And then they either zipped back to a position of safety in a staged position to attack in future, or just went on an attack that did a ton of damage. Either way, these two, Zuleika is on screen now, and that's Zamira if you want to have a look at her profile. Either way, both of them are excellent recipients of all of Saladin's benefits and are very good offensive pieces to pair with the more defensive pieces that Matawiya and Dalami represent. If you had to just pick one, you would usually pick Zuleika, but I generally take both and I very, very rarely regret it. Now, with our defensive irregulars spoken about and our offensive irregulars spoken about, we'll talk about our specialist irregulars, and that's where we get to Hunzakuts, generally taken as either of these two forward observer profiles. You have a very cheap, for an infiltrating willpower 14 specialist, 15-point forward observer boarding shotgun with decharges. It also has a boarding pistol, which is really nice, which means it can make attacks threatening that template weapon. But the main advantage of this piece is that it is regular thanks to Saladin, and it is in the midfield, and it is basically the cheapest midfield specialist in the entire game, I think, and particularly given that it's willpower 14, it's not bad at pressing buttons at all. And because with Saladin it is regular, you can just put it in a position where at any point during the game it might accomplish some mission objective that requires a specialist, and if it does nothing else for the entire game, then it was only 15 points for a regular order, which is a touch expensive but entirely worthwhile when you consider the specialist benefits that it offers. Now, for a touch more points, the 19-point version is more deluxe. The main things that it gives you are valuable deployable weapons. Now, there are some scenarios, like corporate appropriation, where decharges are valuable, but being able to lay shock mines and deployable repeaters are both really nice. Particularly with the change to pitches in N5 and the changes again in October 2025, our network projection in Haqqislam is a little bit limited these days, and in fact, basically the best network projection we'll have in terms of reliability is using a coordinated order just to move a Hunzakut forward a couple of times for free, and then just place a deployable repeater. We've got some quite capable hackers and some especially capable killer hackers in this faction, and although 19 points actually honestly is a little bit expensive, particularly compared to its 15-point counterpart, having access to that as network projection is just kind of valuable, and you should keep that in mind when deciding which of these two Hunzakuts you're taking. They are AVA2, and you will often, depending on scenarios, take one or both of the AVA you have for these, just because, particularly as regular troopers, they're good solid value. Now, the final really notable irregular in Haqqislam is the Bashi Bazouk. It's our weird, interesting, and useful irregular trooper because it has just a bunch of different things going on. Firstly, it has Hollow Mask and Hollow Projector, which means that if you want to, you can take one of these and use it as 3 different Saladin decoys, just to really create a bunch of fog of war for your opponent as to which of your Saladins is real. As noted, I personally tend not to do that terribly much, but particularly if you are learning the faction and if you're finding you're getting Saladin killed, take a Bashi Bazouk. It's relatively cheap and it's one of the best tools that you might find for providing some insulation against that threat to your highly valuable lieutenant. However, on top of that, it also has combat jump and parachutist and a mix of moderately dangerous and or specialist loadouts, which means it's got a bunch of value kind of no matter what. Now, there are actually a fair few different Bashi Bazouk profiles that are appealing for this reason. I quite like the Contender profile, I quite like the T2 boarding shotgun profile, I kind of like all of the specialist profiles, although would probably default toward the cheapest one if I'm going to use it mostly just as a decoy for Saladin who might press a button. But frankly, any of these profiles can be useful. There's a reasonable difference in price points. They are generally mostly affordable, and although I don't take a Bashi Bazouk in every list, it's pretty rare that I regret taking one when I do, just because at the price point, there's almost always going to be something that's interesting and useful that they can do. Now, to touch very briefly on 2 more irregulars, a Warcore. It's 3 points and regular. That really is all that you need to know about it with Saladin, but usually you will find yourself spending 2 points to turn it into a 5-point model. I don't take a Warcore particularly often, although there is one list that you might include it in, which is the Oops All Irregulars so that you can afford 3 tags. But otherwise, generally, you're better off using the troop slot that this model represents to take something that's actually dangerous. Finally, Yan Yan are actually really cool. They're fast, mobile, and interesting, but they're kind of made a little bit superfluous by how many other sources of smoke we have access to in this faction, and how much more dangerous as offensive units the Biker Twins are. But if you want to, you absolutely can use one of these. Just bear in mind that it's not a particularly good recipient of Saladin's coordinated orders, because it won't be able to use super jump jet propulsion, meaning it's footslogging at 4-4 as part of any orders that it coordinates in. Now, that's all of our lengthy discussion around Haqqislam, Saladin, and the irregulars that he can take. From here, we're going to move through light infantry into medium, into heavies, etc. And we're going to move fairly quickly through all of these because, again, there's a whole bunch to cover. And we're going to start with actually a relatively notable one, which is Odalisks. These were a major beneficiary of the October 2025 balance updates. And while you might argue that they still have kind of a bloated profile, that bloat no longer overwhelms them, they're actually kind of efficient troops for the cost. What these can best be thought of as kind of as proto-super soldier style troopers, or as pseudo-heavy infantry, because they're only ballistic skill 12, but they are 6-2 move, armor 2, BTS 3, with no wound incapacitation and shock immunity. They also have just a grab bag of other skills. They've got combat instinct and sixth sense and stealth and natural born warrior and a big discover bonus. You can also theoretically medkit them quite aggressively, but don't do that because you'll kill them if you fail. And then we've got a number of quite interesting weapon loadouts, which are made further interesting by the fact that these can form the basis of a fairly valuable duo or Haris team. They can be used both as a duo and as 2 members in a Haris. If you're running them as a duo, you'll probably want to include the Marksmanship Viral Marksman Rifle profile, which, particularly with +1 special die, is a very serviceable gunfighter if you can find the right targets for it. Costs you no SWC, and while 28 points isn't cheap, it's not terribly expensive either, and it's easy to give +1 special die with any of the other cheap profiles. Of the other cheap profiles, my preferential ones are the Ballistic Skill Attack +1 Burst Boarding Shotgun, which for 22 points is a very good door kicking profile, since you can come around a corner and be rolling 4 dice with that shotgun if you're on a fire team. I also like the Paramedic because it's a specialist. Its weapon loadout is fine, and it's 21 points for a pseudo 2 wound willpower 14 specialist who is reasonable at bringing things back, although you won't be actually using the Paramedic terribly often because a ton of stuff in this faction is either no wound incapacitation or dogged. But if we're putting a Haris team together and we have something like a Janissary heavy machine gun, for example, that's a pretty good target for emergency resuscitation with the Paramedic, in addition to her being a specialist. Finally, the Disco Ball profile is very notable. It also has a submachine gun, and so you can do quite a nice thing, for example, where you have a Haris team of a Janissary, the submachine gun Odalisk with the Disco Baller, and the submachine gun Odalisk with the Paramedic, with the Medikit. And on, say, turn 3, if you're going first, you can have moved them up into the midfield, and you can use one of your final coordinated orders to drop them all into suppressive fire, and that is a hell of a bulwark for your opponent to try and get past, because those are all good quality suppressive fire pieces, potentially with multiple wounds, is hugely resilient, and it's very good for locking down things like acquisition style scenarios or defensive play. And access to a disco ball gives Haqqislam something that it otherwise really struggled to find. Now, there was, since the beginning of N5, there was access to Eclipse Smoke in Haqqislam, but it was gated behind more expensive pieces. The Odalisk at 21 points gives you linked disco, which even at ballistic skill 12 is very reliable, and that gives you a tool for getting past even dedicated and powerful MSV ARO pieces, which is just very valuable. In the list that we show off at the end of this video, we're very likely to see an Odalisk with Disco Baller and an Odalisk Paramedic, Haris teamed with that Janissary, which gives us a fire team that we'll put outside of Saladin's combat group, because obviously they're not going to be coordinating much for most of the game, but overall just a really good addition to the faction. Even if they have an absolute paragraph of special skills, the core of it is they're fast, they're durable, and they're useful, which is fantastic. Next up, we have the Havsa unit. Now, not as viable in Haqqislam as in Kapukauki, but still kind of useful. If you are looking for a lieutenant that isn't Saladin, a good choice is the Lieutenant +1 order, because there are some serviceable NCOs in this faction. If you aren't taking Lieutenant +1 order and you have some other active turn lieutenant, then 20-point Hollow Mask Chain of Command is quite useful. And frankly, I've even gotten reasonably good use out of the Forward Observer, because you can duo that with something like a Shakush or a Magariba Guard, just to have a specialist stapled to them. In particular, before the October update, I found that a Havsa Forward Observer and a Shakush was just a very consistent team. It tended to be quite good at moving around, pressing buttons, laying some deployable repeaters, taking gunfights. Really couldn't ask for a great deal more for the points cost. All of which collectively gives the Havsa unit a fair bit of utility, but it is by no means essential, particularly if you're taking Saladin as your lieutenant. They are more pieces that tend to come into their own in lists that are choosing not to run Saladin, which there might be a variety of reasons why, but like I said, probably 90 to 95% of lists will be Saladin lists. Havsa are kind of for the remaining 5 to 10%. Next up, we have Nauf Outlaw Sniper. And Nauf is a model that is kind of uniquely useful in vanilla Haqqislam. Because vanilla Haqqislam does have access to some very good doctors, the fact that Nauf doesn't have a cube and is single wound becomes a little bit less of an issue, because even with a generic Ghulam doctor, you've got fairly serviceable means of bringing him back to have another go. Now, generally I wouldn't put Nauf in a ton of lists, but there are firepower-based lists where you have things like, for example, Nauf and an Azrael, both of which are models that benefit from a doctor, so we take a doctor as well, and that's a pretty reasonable firepower loadout if you're not using things like smoke and irregulars to attack under cover of that smoke, etc. If you're looking for a bit more generic firepower dominance that isn't a Mukhtar and a Janissary, that can work quite well. Particularly in radial deployment scenarios, it's worth bearing Nauf in mind, because those scenarios tend to enable very long-range firefight because you're fighting corner to corner, and in those circumstances, frankly, Nauf is the best sniper in the entire faction, and that makes him worth a look in, if only for those scenarios. Now, since we've mentioned it, we should talk about Ghulam Infantry. I've said many good things about Ghulam Infantry in the past, but they aren't linkable in vanilla Haqqislam, so there are a lot more limitations on how we might use them here. Still, there are a few profiles that are worth considering. The obvious one is the Doctor. It's a Doctor +3, which means it's willpower 17 effective for only 15 points, 18 points with the Helper Bot, which is the most efficient Doctor in the entire game. Now, as I mentioned, you kind of have to build to make use of that force reconstitution, because so much of a Haqqislam list can easily be no win incapacitation or dogged. You often don't need a doctor because your models are fully effective until they're dead. But if you're running Nauf and an Azrael, then fitting a Ghulam doctor in makes plenty of sense, and she's very cheap. The Ghulam Hacker is also a relatively cheap willpower 14 hacker. Sometimes you just need a hacker, and it's a very, very cheap version of one. And then finally, some consideration can be given to the NCO. Not in a Saladin list, it's not particularly useful there, there are much better options. But if we're not running Saladin and we are running a Havsa, Then we have multiple lieutenant orders, and we could give consideration to taking multiple NCOs potentially, and a Gulam NCO rifle, smoke grenade launcher, and grenade launcher could be a good, say, Combat Group 2 NCO, just as an order outlet. Another cheap and cheerful light infantry that's worth considering is the Haqqislam Barid. Now, in the past, for example, if you've watched my N4 Haqqislam faction focus, I was a very, very big fan of Barids. Not so much these days, although they are still useful. I used to love taking one hacker and one killer hacker Barid. We can't anymore because they're now just AVA 1, and although Ballistic Skill 12 is still a good Ballistic Skill to have on a pitcher, the change to pitcher range bands have done quite a number on how consistent and reliable the Barid is. The saving grace is that point for point, a killer hacker with Trinity -3 is still one of the best killer hackers in the game at 14 points. And because we are spending a lot of orders in any given game, much of the time making ballistic skill attacks with targetless weapons, you can just put a pitcher into that rule, activate them as part of the same coordinated orders, and get the occasional free repeater out into the midfield as part of other stuff that you were doing anyway. If you're doing that, you do need to consider getting some baggage into the list, which adds a troop slot impost. But a Haqqislam Barid, particularly the killer hacker, is just a good, valuable KHD, with really the only restriction on it being, do you have the troop slot spare, and in your opinion, is it worth taking killer hackers in whatever your current metagame is? On a very similar note, if you are troop slot constrained and are looking for a hacker of some description, Layla Sharif can be a very good choice. You would need to pair her with a Hunzakut with the deployable repeater just for some network projection, because she doesn't have that herself, but provided you can get repeaters out for her, she's a very good standalone killer hacker. And the reason for that is she's got a firewall, so she's a little tricky to kill. She's got combat instinct, so Sixth Sense is not effective against her. She's willpower 14 BTS 3, and she has a killer hacking device with Carbonite, which means that she can kind of cover off on all of your hacking needs. She doesn't have Spotlight, but she makes your repeaters basically live all the time, even if she isn't quite as good at killer hacking as a Barid, because the Barid's Trinity is more powerful. She's a much better generalist piece, and hey, you can even do things like have her lay EM mines, if that's something that's useful as perhaps part of an order outlet idea. In Combat Group 2, for example, she's very good as being a splash of hacking and some utility, although at 22 points, not expensive, but not cheap either. Now, much more expensive, but potentially very valuable, is Fiddler, Aristea's ex-toymaker. And Fiddler is a piece that everyone kind of went off on the beginning of N5 for some reason, and who I think is genuinely excellent. You almost always want to take the model that has two jackpots, and basically what she is kind of a do-everything model, but she's also very, very good at going after and cracking really hard targets. One of the things that you can kind of struggle with in Haqqislam is that you have lists that very easily hit 14 or 15 viable active troops, but none of them are high watermark power pieces. And that means that if your opponent just puts something really, really strong in the midfield, right? Your opponent just slams Achilles into the midfield, or a combined army aspect, or Psheshkin with multiple wounds, or something. Dealing with that can be really tricky because you're coming at it with all of these pieces that are perhaps a little bit specialized and a little bit cheap, and which you don't have the guns to just overwhelm. Fiddler represents an answer to that problem because two jackpots, potentially plus herself, is basically very difficult for anything to effectively defend against if she gets inside good range. And so if you need close assault or hard target destruction, she's just very valuable for that, and she can get to places that the bikers can't. Now, ultimately, what lets her down, because she's basically good at everything else, she's a specialist, she's good at close assault, she's reasonably durable, etc. What lets her down is that she can't be part of a coordinated order. And the reason she's not in too many of my lists anymore, despite the fact that I spent a bunch of time with her this edition, is just that if I'm building a Saladin list, I'm building it to use coordinated orders, and she can't do that. She has to be the one that spends orders that aren't coordinated. And while that is definitely something that you can accommodate, it's just not a strength that I'm currently emphasizing. I'm looking to make use of those coordinated orders, which makes her more of a sometimes piece, but bear her in mind if you are finding, if you're playing games and you're finding that you're struggling with hard target removal, she's a piece to consider. Now, just to breeze through a couple more light infantry, the Haqqislam Nadir is a dangerous ambush piece. There's actually a bunch of potentially viable pieces here, but the most common one is often going to be the Flamen Spear, although if you have the point spare, often you won't. I do actually find myself quite liking the Mine Layer Viral Mine AP Marksman Rifle profile. That's potentially quite dangerous. But much of the time, the Nadir is a hidden deployment mimetism -6 Panzerfaust. It's basically a Noctifer for much cheaper. Yes, it doesn't have a missile launcher, but it's terribly cheap and does much of the same work. Ambush tactics are kind of an acquired taste. You need to learn how to use them. Hidden deployment keeps an order away from you, which you might otherwise want on the first turn. There's a balancing act to be struck there, but when a nadir performs, it can be very powerful. It can combine well with other pieces. You can do things like put the nadir inside a Dalami, right? You deploy the nadir first, then you remove it from the table, then you place the Dalami, which gives you a layered ARO, because both those models can ARO at the same time, which can be a very nasty surprise for your opponent. Just a bunch that you can do with a piece like this if you decide you want a hidden deployment ambush element. Finally, the last light infantry of note, Corsairs of the Gate. Technically, these are linkable. Personally, I wouldn't. Yes, you can get 2 of them into a Haris team to give duo bonuses, but just take Odalisks instead. However, that Parachutist Deployment Zone profile is worth at least experimenting with, because Parachutist Deployment Zone is a very good rule. Oh, okay, deep breath. On to the medium infantry. This will happily be a shorter list, starting with Zayadan intervention troops. This is not Rama Task Force, so these are not quite as appealing, but you can put them in a pure duo and a Zayadan heavy machine gun plus a Zayadan doctor, or even in some circumstances a Zayadan AP sniper rifle plus a Zayadan doctor is something that you might choose to consider. Personally, for my money, you will find better choices in Haqqislam, but marksmanship and warhorse and regeneration are kind of good, and 5 dice on 15s with a heavy machine gun is not the worst face-to-face roll in the game. I would usually prefer them in Rama Task Force, and even then you wouldn't always take them, but they are worth considering in Haqqislam. Skimming on past Janbazans because I don't care, we get to Hassassin Rajiks, which are a very serviceable and dangerous drop troop. Now, all 3 of these profiles are potentially viable. The 23-point boarding shotgun +1 burst profile is very dangerous on the attack. Ballistic skill 12 is fine for a weapon like that, and it has dogged and shock immune, which makes it very good at doing a lot of damage before it goes down. And if you want a specialist, then that's a willpower 15 hacker if you'd like to use that. It's also got decharges and it's an elite troop, which means that the Hassassin Rajik hacker is very good at doing classifieds and pressing buttons. And finally, the Spitfire is a Spitfire on a Ballistic Skill 12 dogged unit with super jump jet propulsion. I would usually lean towards the boarding shotgun +1 burst and making a mess, but there are plenty of scenarios where that hacker is very valuable as well, and frankly, all of those points cost, but especially the 23 and 25-point ones, are a bit of a steal for the cost. Moving on from the Rajik, just to mention them for the sake of completeness, we have the Sekban Naval Special Unit. This is a regiment that you will not take at all, basically, in a Saladin list, but who become much more viable if we're not taking Saladin for whatever reason and we're taking a Havsa Lieutenant instead. They have NCO and can be 2 members of a 3-person Haris team, so you can run 2 Sekbans and a Janissary and have a very serviceable team to use as an outlet for those orders. Usually in that case, you'll take probably the boarding shotgun 19-point profile and the 23-point doctor profile, both of which supplement the Janissary well, but again, this is a choice really only for if we aren't taking Saladin as the lieutenant. In those 95% of cases where we are taking Saladin as the lieutenant, the last medium-heavy infantry, but one that will fit into many lists, is the Mukhtar Active Response Unit. Now, these are a little pricey, but they can form a pure duo, or they can just run as an independent element, and that is usually how I will run them because, as noted, we are doing a lot of coordinated orders in this faction. If you do duo them, any of the specialist profiles are viable. There's a doctor, a forward observer, and a hacker, but the important piece to have access to is the gunfighting one. Multispectral visor level 2, remember we have a ton of smoke in this faction, you will get smoke down basically for free. MSV 2, Mimetism 3, good ballistic skill-ish, decent stats, durable thanks to no wound incapacitation shock immunity, and a Red Fury. Now, Red Furies have Red Fury problems, which is to say that they are only damage 7, but you're very good at winning face-to-face rolls with the Mukhtar. You're very good at getting into good range because you'll just use it as part of a coordinated order to get into a position where that 24 inches is exactly what you want. And at that point, if you have to take 2 or 3 orders to suppress an enemy piece, no problem, just do it. You should have those orders available. The Mukhtar is a very valuable firepower piece to have in basically any list because of all the smoke that we can throw. And at 34 points, it is an impost on your list. You might not always take it. For example, a list that's running Nauf and an Azrael might not take a Muqtar just for points cost reasons. But it's a very high value gunfighter, and don't underestimate its ability not just to be used for rampart sweeping to do things like put down enemy total reaction bots, but once it gets into the midfield, which it can easily do, it's 6-2 and you have coordinated orders to move it forward, and it forward deploys. You can actually often find yourself taking gunfights that are even more advantageous, and when an opponent is out of cover, perhaps because you've gotten into an enfilade position and are firing down on them, through smoke, well, that damage 7 on the Red Fury at that point really stops mattering because you will connect and you will deal damage, and under those circumstances, a Muqtar goes from valuable and useful to really, really lethal. Speaking of lethality, it's time to finally get into our heavy infantry, and we'll begin with the Special Deterrence Group Azrael. This is a specialized gunfighting piece, specialized in the sense that it has no visual modifiers and mediocre ballistic skill. It also lacks any way whatsoever to ignore enemy modifiers, but if you can get a gunfight where it can actually land hits, it is ballistic skill attack SR-1, armor piercing with continuous damage, which means that for just 37 points, it will absolutely blow up whatever it actually connects with. If you're taking an Azrael, you'll usually want a Doctor, but especially if you can reconstitute it, it makes a good static firepower piece. It's not even halfway bad as an ARO piece if you need it to be. And it's basically the definitive answer in faction to something like a Yotum or enemy tag, because it's very good at putting down tags without visual modifiers off the back of the power of particularly that AP heavy machine gun with continuous and enhanced damage. Our more well-rounded heavy infantry is the Janissary, just generally well-statted and costed to boot. Important things to note about the Janissary is that it does not have a Q, but it is Phys 14, so it's fairly good at being recovered with a paramedic. It's Ballistic Skill 14, one of the only models in faction that isn't a tag with that Ballistic Skill score, and it has the Ballistic Skill Attack -3 rule. That makes it a pretty good gunfighter. There are a lot of warhorses in the game that will ignore that, but by itself that's a good gunfighter. And a single Janissary can be included as part of a Haqqislam Fire Team 2, which can be a Haris, which means we can have things like 2 Odalisks or 2 Sec Bands, and a Janissary as the active turn gun. You can also use the missile launcher as a reactive piece. For my money, generally speaking, what I'll be taking is the heavy machine gun, but the missile launcher is also an option if you want a dedicated ARO piece. In terms of solo heavy infantry again, also quite elite, we have the Asawira Regiment. Now, there are a bunch of profiles that you could potentially use here. The AP Spitfire is an AP Spitfire on an excellent chassis, right? 6-2 move, CC23 with good Berserk +3, martial arts level 2. That gives it a very, very high CC score, which means it's very likely to crit. It's got Ballistic Skill 14, Phys 14, Willpower 14, Armor 4, BTS 9, it regenerates. Just a hell of a profile, although it does have Frenzy, which in particular for the gunfighting ones, if you're taking the AP Spitfire, does become a little bit of an issue in later turns. For that reason, my favored profile is the boarding shotgun +1 burst disco baller profile, because for 32 points, it's a hell of a close assault piece. We can use it as part of coordinated targetless weapon orders. Those same coordinated orders will help deliver it up the field, and once you get it close to an opponent, it will just unleash absolute hell, because it's a ballistic skill 14 +1 burst boarding shotgun who's also very good at close combat and is potentially approaching under Eclipse with stealth, which means that really its only vulnerability is something like a Sixth Sense hacker with a good repeater area, or hacking covering the terminal approach when it has to break stealth. Now, it is a mono rule or mono purpose kind of trooper, right? It is really just used for disco and close assault. And there's a pretty solid argument that 32 points is not necessarily easy to afford for that, particularly when we have things like the biker twins. But if you can afford it, it fits neatly enough into a list that it will absolutely do a bunch of damage and is a worthwhile inclusion. Finally, just 2 more pieces to mention in passing. The Boktar. The Boktar is very expensive, but it does have tactical awareness, and for that reason actually makes a fairly viable lieutenant choice if we're not taking Saladin. Remember, we have quite cheap chain of command in this faction, which lets something like that Red Fury Boktar lieutenant really do a lot in every single turn. It's got jet propulsion and good movement stats, it's got mimetism and an MSV1, but basically all of these profiles are quite reliable, they're just very expensive. Also very expensive, but a touch more interesting, is the Sundok Butt Covert Heavy Support Unit. Now, there are a bunch of different things we might consider here. Each of them have different unique applications. My preferred profile is the Neurokinetics AP Spitfire. It's got decoy and camouflage but no mimetism, which means it's very good at sitting in the middle of a field of Delami, where it's very easy for it to look like two more Delami in the middle of that field of no mimetism camouflage markers. But when that AP Spitfire reveals with burst 4 in ARO, that is an extremely different prospect to anything else your opponent might be expecting from those camouflage markers, and can do a tremendous amount of damage in reactive turn. Ultimately, 15 points is really goddamn expensive. 50 points is really goddamn expensive, so just like, that is very hard to include in a list. It doesn't quite meet the threshold of pure meme troop, but is at least partly a meme troop because of that cost. Just be aware that it's a bit of a lethal joke character in that respect, and yeah, you can make a list that makes it work, and you will blow out your opponent some of the time. The other one kind of to consider is the surprise attack mine layer with a viral rifle. Ultimately, this one fails a little bit by dint of being very ballistic skill 13, but it does put a bunch of camouflage markers into the midfield and a viral mine, and it's modestly durable, and so it's worth considering for a laugh occasionally. Into our tags now. Basically, all of them are at least modestly viable, perhaps not the Trip Hammer. There are 4 tags available to this faction: the Magariba Guard, Scarface, the Shakush, and then the Trip Hammer. Of these, I don't mind the Shakush at all. It is relatively cheap for a ballistic skill 14 continuous damage heavy machine gun. As noted, it can duo, and it duos reasonably nicely with a Havsa forward observer, who is a very cheap specialist to staple to it. The Magariba Guard, by comparison, is a bit more of a classic, and she does have a baggage mine dispenser combination, which is really nice, although you could reasonably use any of these profiles. She is modestly costed. 71 points is not bad at all for what you get. The main disadvantage of her is that she is a Silhouette 8 model, and that can just be very difficult to hide on some tables. Finally, Scarface kind of threads the needle between the two. He's got some close assault, he's got a reasonable gun setup, he's generally solid and very efficiently costed, with the only downside being that if you take him, you must take his sister Cordelia Turner, and she's a bit more expensive and kind of degrades the value proposition a little bit. If you have a use for her as an engineer, you can make Scarface work, and in fact you can make all of the tags in this faction work if you really lean on the Irregulars as discounts to underwrite taking them. It's actually quite possible to write a list that has 11 irregular troops and 4 regular troops, those 4 regular troops being Saladin and 3 individual tags. Is that a meme list? Actually, only kind of. To be honest, it's pretty serviceable. And so basically, don't sleep on any of the tags that are in this faction, because we can underwrite them effectively with our cheaper irregular troops. Finally, onto the second last category, our skirmishers. And we will pause to linger briefly here on the Haqqislam Fidei, because it is very unique. It is a very good quality, cheap impersonation trooper that many people nevertheless, I think quite reasonably, have reported having a lot more difficulty using in N5. Now, I've done a little bit of casting around about this, and the broad conclusion that I've come to is if you are an N4 Haqqislam player, one of the things that you'll have an access to with the Haqqislam Fidei is boarding shotguns that were a template weapon. And this was a really big deal because it enabled her to trade very effectively. She could lay down 2 templates with that boarding shotgun, which presented an extremely lethal fork with her close combat abilities, and that made her exceedingly good at eliminating one single target with extreme prejudice, which is typically all that you took her for. That doesn't work in N5. Now, to make up for that, she's more dangerous in melee than she has ever been. Martial Arts 3 is a really big deal these days, and you have a DACCW even on the very cheap 23-point profile. How then to use a Haqqislam Fidei? Here is my advice. When you deploy the Haqqislam Fidei, you want to put it in a position where other models in your army can support it at long range. Remember, this is a faction where we're making many coordinated orders, and we can potentially have, fairly easily, 3 smoke grenade launchers on fast chassis in a list. That means how I like to use a Haqqislam Fidei is to put it in maybe a slightly more exposed position, but where I'm going to be able to lay down smoke for it at long range with 2 bikers and a Zabak, which then lets it just move into melee and take full advantage of those close combat skills. Now, Is that a bit more laborious? Is that more work than just using the shotgun? Yes, absolutely. For that reason, do I use a Haqqislam Fade in every single list? No, absolutely not. But if you're looking to make a Haqqislam Fade viable, and you're struggling a little bit with it in the absence of the templates it had in N4, that's my advice. Think about how you can support it from your side of the table using things like smoke grenade launchers, because that can really set up some effective attack runs, making the Fidea very valuable, for example, Combat Group 2 attack piece that can get into close combat and score kills against hard targets, thanks to smoke support from downtown. Now, in the more traditional skirmisher role, and very interesting, we have the Murabid's Tuareg. My preferred profile here is the Killer Hacker, and it's a really solid profile. 28 points is not cheap, but not expensive at all for what you're getting, and what you're getting is a Willpower 15 hacker with killer hacking and a firewall. Now, not only is that an exceptional specialist in general terms, but it's also very good at hacking assassination. That makes it a little bit of a meta choice because you don't always know that you're going to need that. But if, in your opinion, the ability to go after and put down enemy hackers is valuable, that Murabid Tuareg can be very valuable herself. Just be aware there's a little bit of a limitation to what she can actually go after in terms of cracking hard targets, and something like, for example, a firewall Deferson might be a little bit beyond her ability to deal with. Finally, we have two classic skirmishers. The Al Hawa is a classic midfield skirmisher if you're looking for a classic midfield killer hacker or forward observer. Relatively cheap, but usually it will be displaced by a Hunzakut. And then the Hassassin Farzan, again, forward observer, often will be displaced by a Hunzakut, although you do get a fair bit for the upgrade in this particular case. What's particularly interesting about the Farzan is that you have a viral mine layer for only 21 points. Not necessarily a piece that you would put in every single list, but there are a lot of scenarios at the moment that there is benefit to be able to secure a position, and having a viral mine layer can be quite good for that. Finally, and as we cross over the hour mark, rounding out the Haqqislam army list, we have two vehicles, the Haytham Aero Unit and the Zabak Aero Unit. To learn more about these, please go and watch my video about flyers where I talk about both of them in detail. But in short, the Haytham is a very good general purpose flyer. It's particularly excellent at putting down other flyers, but that Red Fury profile for 1.5 SWC and 33 points is just generally very good at doing vehicle things. It punches down into exposed enemy models, it uses its mobility to move and get plunging fire, and it's basically good and solid at doing all of the things a vehicle is typically good at. The Zabak, by comparison, is very unique in that it is relying on albedo -6, which is a bit more of a niche rule, but we have a lot of smoke in this list, including a smoke grenade launcher from the Zabak itself, which means that MSVs are a bit more of an issue, which means that albedo is, by comparison, a more valuable skill. It's also got ballistic skill attack -3 and an AP Spitfire, and it is durable thanks to being Armor 5 and BTS 6 and having a pilot inside, all of which ultimately make it one of the preferred vehicles in the game for me personally. It combines very well with all of the things that we're doing in this faction. It can be part of coordinated orders, moving 8 inches and then laying down smoke with ballistic skill 13. That's really useful. It can go on attack runs. The fact that it's got an AP Spitfire is a really nice addition to lists. And just as one point to consider, it also costs exactly 1.5 SWC and 33 points, which means you can actually do a very interesting thing where if you have a Haqqislam list where you like everything else in the list, you can actually do a list that is identical, right? Two list format. You can have one list that has a Zabak and one list that has a Haytham, and that can be the only point of differentiation between the two. And you can practice that list, and then every single game that you go into, you can just pick the vehicle that you want based on what you're fighting. Are you playing against Kestrel Colonial Force? We take the Zabak. Are we playing against Tartary Army Corps? We take the Haytham. And that's made possible thanks to the fact that the two vehicles cost identical points and is basically as close as you can get to a true sideboard in a game like Infinity, which is really cool and really interesting. Either way, both vehicles are very good, and I talk about both in greater detail in my Vehicles Explained video that you can find on the channel. Now, to put a bow on all of this, wrap all of this up, we have a sample list on screen now, and this is a Haqqislam list that I'm considering taking to the next major event that I attend, and which uses a lot of the strength we've talked about over the course of this video. And we begin, of course, with Saladin. This list is making extensive use of all of the things that he can do. It has 7 irregular troopers, but we also have a primary combat group that's built to have models swap in and out using Strategos and make extensive use of coordinated orders. In this combat group, for this reason, we have all of our unlinked sources of smoke, starting with a Zabak for all of the reasons that I mentioned, just talking about it now. It's an AP Spitfire, it's resilient, and it has a ballistic skill 13 smoke grenade launcher. We've got a Mukta as one of a few different firepower pieces. Our other firepower pieces in this list are a Janissary and the Zabak. The Mukta will be benefiting from coordinated orders to move forward and lots of smoke in order to smoke shoot. We've got Zuleika and Zamira. Both will also be major beneficiaries of coordinated orders to attack, to do things like grab objectives in missions like corporate appropriation or hardlock. They're very good at attacking, they're very good at contributing smoke, they're just generally high value. We have a single Hunzakut, and this is the 19-point version. It's the 19-point version because to get some hacking into the list, we also have Layla Sharif. Now, this is not history's largest possible source of hacking, but it does get the job done. It gives us just a splash, and of course the Hunzakut is a valuable midfield piece. It's a specialist, it can lay mines, it can lay deployable equipment, it's good at securing a position. And if I think I don't need it in Group 1, or I think it will benefit from orders and I don't have anything to do in Group 2, it's one of a couple of pieces that I will comfortably use Strategos 2 to shift into Group 2 to spend orders there. Layla Sharif is another, right? If I'm playing Area of Interest, for example, either the Hunzakut or Layla might get shifted into Group 2, where once the Fade has done its business and I don't need the Janissary, I can use those orders to do things like place deployable equipment. We then have 2 Matawiya. One is a boarding shotgun Emirat, one is a boarding shotgun Jammer. Importantly, these are both smoke grenade profiles, so they can be part of any of the coordinated orders. Usually what we'll do is we'll have something like the Jammer Matawiya. Its main job will be to escort the Mukhtar around. Wherever the Mukhtar moves, it will move as well, and whenever I do a coordinated order that includes doing a targetless attack, that Matawiya will throw down smoke specifically for the Mukhtar. In Combat Group 2, we then have the cheapest assassin for day. Remember, part of what she's going to be doing is receiving smoke from Combat Group 1 to launch attacks, and then the fire team we mentioned earlier. Janissary Heavy Machine Gun in a Haris team with an Odalisk with Disco Ball and an Odalisk Paramedic. Now, there is no ability to reload anything in this list. For that reason, you might consider Speedball just for the ability to reload with Speedball. But most of the time, my impression is that I should be fine with the regular deployable equipment on the Hunzakut and Leela. And look, I'll have potentially 2 disco uses in a game with the Odalisk. The jammers usually do not need to reload. If they've fired off their load, they're doing just fine. So often we'll just be spending 5 command tokens on coordinated orders. Finally, we have 2 Jammer Ghazi Matawiya with Jammer in this combat group. Usually they'll be deployed in a position either where they will never move, or they'll take 1 impetuous order into a safe forward position and then they'll never move from there. They are mostly strictly defensive pieces, but they are fantastic strictly defensive pieces. They are corner guards with chain rifles, they have jammers, they are dogged. Just about the only time they will move out during a turn is if I need to go after enemy camouflage markers in the midfield. I'm comfortable using their jammers in order to do things like make intuitive attacks to attempt to reveal camouflage markers. Overall, this is one of my favorite lists that I have played in N5. It is absolutely not the only way to build a list, even a Saladin list. There are a lot of other options. But this leans into the strengths in a really interesting way, and it does one of those things that I absolutely love about lists in N5 and have always loved in Infinity, which is that it is 15 troops and none of them is a cheerleader. Even the Matawiya in Group 2, those are the closest things we have to cheerleaders, and they can do active turn stuff if they absolutely need to. Even Saladin is an active turn piece some of the time, because you bet your ass if I'm going first, that final coordinated order that he does with his Lieutenant Order on turn 3 is going to include him standing up to take emitter arrows. Now, things that you might choose to change about this list. This 7-point Matawiya could be changed for a remote Fanus remote, or this 8-point Matawiya could be changed for a baggage remote. The reason why either of those is something you might consider is that there is only one repeater in this list. It's on Saladin. And there's a reasonably strong argument for more deployment zone coverage just to supplement things like the Matawiya. Another thing that you might choose to do, and this would require a little bit more fiddling, is to get a Bashi Bazouk into the list just to have, well, it's a flexible piece, but more importantly, if you are worried about needing decoys for Saladin, you could provide that with a Bashi Bazouk. Finally, while I don't personally have one in the list, I would love a Haqqislam Barid in Combat Group 1 just to be part of those coordinated orders and to add a touch more killer hacking power into the list, but ultimately some sacrifices needed to be made to fit all of this stuff in there. Overall, this is a list I can recommend and which I have really enjoyed and which I have played personally and which showcases some of the stuff you can do that is just fascinating with Haqqislam post-October 2025. Now, that concludes this video. If you enjoyed this video and you've made it this far into the video and you'd like to support the channel, you can do so either by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a donor on Buy Me a Coffee. Although I can't make every single video that anyone requests, I do take requests and I write down whenever someone who is either a supporter or a channel member makes a comment about things they'd like to see. That goes into the list, and that list helps inform future videos. Also, I will from time to time put a poll up that will be members only, just in terms of what are things that you would like to see, what should next week's video be, etc. So if you'd like to be able to vote in those when they come up, you can do so by becoming a member on YouTube. Otherwise, we put videos out about once a week. And so I hope very much that you've enjoyed this. I'll be back next week with more Infinity content.